So let me briefly say a couple of words about Todd. Todd McGowan is professor of film studies at the University of Vermont. I think with his work, Todd has in recent years created quite an enormous and remarkable and justifiably so reputation for himself as someone who is able to bring together major theoretical figures, at least in some of his works, but major theoretical figures like Hegel, Marx, or Freud. And he seeks to demonstrate and is able to demonstrate how their ideas manifest, appear, and are elucidated in and by films, television series, and in and by other media formats. He has written books on comedy, capitalism, and various filmmakers, such as Only a Joke Can Save Us, a theory of comedy, Capitalism and Desire, The Psychic Cost of Free Markets, The Impossible David Lynch, The Fictional Christopher Nolan, and most recently, Universality and Identity Politics, that's 2020, and Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution, that's 2019. I think especially his work on psychoanalytic film theory elaborated quite a genuinely novel way of thinking about the relationship between us engaging with a film and the, let's say, almost ontological status of the cinematographic image itself. So he will today speak, as is common, for about an hour, and then we move into the discussion part for about, I don't know, 55 minutes or something like that, because Todd, and this makes you see how kind he is, will directly afterwards go and have to teach. Todd will speak today about enjoying right and left. And thank you so much for agreeing to be with us here, at least virtually. The floor, or maybe the virtual space, is yours.
Frank, thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks for that generous introduction. Way too generous. And I'm really delighted that you began with my book on comedy, which most often gets elided because that's the favorite thing I've done, and hopefully it'll integrate itself into this discussion as well. So I'm taking as the point of departure, and the thesis of my talk is this: that political struggles take place to determine what form of enjoyment will predominate. So that's the basic idea. And so I think, although it seems initially pretty distant from politics, when we recognize what's at stake in enjoyment, I think this claim seems less outlandish, less bizarre, that because enjoyment's not just pleasure, it's not simply, say, the experience of eating an ice cream cone or buying a new car. Instead, it's something like continuing to eat ice cream cones after one is full, or buying a new car that one cannot afford and that drives one into bankruptcy. So we enjoy what is not useful, what's not good for us, what's not good for our health, what's not good for our well-being. So enjoyment, you might say, is pleasure taken to the point that it becomes ruinous for us. But at the same time, this experience of enjoyment provides a reason to keep going in life. So it's the motivation to get out of bed in the morning and engage with the world. When we enjoy, I think we touch on what exceeds everyday life, and in a way, we find the secret sauce that makes this everyday life bearable for us. So enjoyment's always excessive. It's always not just what's pleasing, but crucially, I think, what's disturbing, what bothers us. So it manifests itself in things like ecstatic religious experience, devotion to a favorite sports team. This is maybe my personal favorite form of enjoyment that's most close to my heart. The dedication to an unhealthy food. I also like this one. The passion for a lover who portends certain heartbreak. I'm a little more immune to this. The excesses of enjoyment don't confine themselves to personal life, unlike these examples, but actually, I think, define the political field as well. So we see this enjoyment in massive political rallies, vehement protests, and even sometimes in outbursts of revolutionary or reactionary fervor. So enjoyment is not just, I want to claim, a large quantity of pleasure, but pleasure that undergoes a transformation so that it becomes painful for us to bear. So pleasures can, I think, be strictly pleasurable without any inner of pain, but one has to suffer one's enjoyment. So enjoyment involves giving oneself excess trouble or creating excess excitation for oneself, whereas pleasure, as Freud defines it, and I like his definition, it occurs with the elimination of excess excitation, excess stimulation. So this excessiveness of enjoyment, I think, is what gives it its political radicality. So it takes us out of everyday existence, out of the everyday, it's because enjoyment goes beyond the possibilities present for me in my everyday social position, it troubles not only me, but also the social order itself. And this is where I think the political edge of it lies. So the way that say a political protest might interfere with the flow of traffic stands as a nice synecdoche for the disruptiveness of enjoyment. So enjoyment involves going beyond the constraints of the givens of a social order in a way that I think pleasure doesn't. So it might be pleasant to drive fast, but it's enjoyable to block the traffic flow for the sake of protesting some new law, some new fuel tax, let's say, if you have a yellow vest. That was a funny slip. Fast drivers keep things moving. It's a good leftist slip. Fast drivers keep things moving while protests bring things to a stop. Or we might say pleasure fits while enjoyment doesn't. So this gives enjoyment this radical political charge relative to pleasure, which pleasure, that is, always relies on leaving things as they are. So politics is what gives a form for our enjoyment. So political campaigns, I think, offer the promise of some specific form of enjoyment to those who support them. And this is what energizes the support. This is why people get so invested in political campaign, political struggle. It provides a way of organizing enjoyment so that the possibility for this enjoyment appears maximized, or the threat that others pose to it appears minimized. I think that's really important, that it's not just maximizing my own enjoyment, it's minimizing the threat that others represent for it. So enjoyment actually plays a determinative role, I think, in what society looks like. So one political leader, let's say, might allow people to take pride in and enjoy their nation by ridding it of outsiders. That might be the program. Another might offer the enjoyment of collective sacrifice to fight climate change. A third might propose a completely transformative move of society by turning capitalism into some kind of communist alternative. Not so much today. A social order's political structure emerges out of a struggle, I want to claim, between competing forms of enjoyment such as these. And the struggle itself, I think, reveals the nature of these competing forms of enjoyment. So we don't have to wait for what the realization of the political program is to grasp the operative form of enjoyment. Instead, we can see it in the struggle itself, in the form that the struggle takes. So every political position that people take up already demonstrates, I think, the form of enjoyment that they hope will prevail. So how one enjoys, I think, defines how one functions as a political actor. So I want to quickly take a look at the 2020 presidential election in the United States. I hope to not be too parochial, but I know that this was followed around the world, but I think it's actually mirrored in other global contexts. In fact, you could even translate this into Macron's Zemmour in France at this present moment. So Trump promised to sustain a nationalist and ethnocentric enjoyment that he successfully, I think, unleashed in his one term as president. So he organized enjoyment through this slogan, everyone knows it, "Make America Great Again." By the way, I was going to wear the hat, but I wouldn't have been able to cross the campus at the University of Vermont, and I would have lost my job. So I don't have a hat, but I was thinking of buying it just for the talk, just to demonstrate. But I think it just shows the way in which that even that piece of garb really embodies the enjoyment to such an extent that it's simply not allowed at the University of Vermont. But this slogan, this hat, allowed partisans to enjoy the excesses of the American nation, to bask in the nation's worst transgressions without any apology, and to believe in their racial superiority. So it was clearly there was a racial tinge to it. So Trump licensed acting without regard for the limitations that govern the social order. So as a Trump supporter, one could do what? One could beat up protesters with impunity. One could identify with racist police violence, or one could wear this baseball hat that was certain to offend polite liberal society. So like you wear a hat, there's no, like I'm wearing this hat today, unfortunately, there's no jouissance enjoyment factor in it, but for the MAGA hat, the Make America Great Again hat, there is that. So even just wearing a hat becomes a source of enjoyment. To identify with Trump was also to enjoy his transgressions. And this is why I think he's a very interesting figure in this way, and different than Zemmour, I think. That one could vicariously, I'm quoting him, grab them by the pussy. One could swindle investors. One could hobnob with celebrities like Tom Brady. One could do what? One could insult one's enemies without repercussions. And even, I think this is a nice little added part, one could partake in incestuous comments about his daughter's sex appeal, right? Which were just incredible, really. But I think that those weren't things that, again, I think a lot of people have said this, these weren't things that counted against him. But why didn't they count against him? They didn't count against him because they increased the enjoyment factor of supporting him. So his own transgressions actually turned him into a source of enjoyment for his followers, and in no way detracted from his appeal, but were central to it, because they provided a way for these supporters to enjoy in a way they otherwise couldn't. And I think his policies interestingly aligned with that because they pushed this enjoyment even further. So when demonstrators marched against police violence toward the end of his first term, only term so far in office in 2020, Trump's response was to refuse to authorize, of course, any change in policing strategies, to blame the protesters for causing problems, to embrace those who shot protesters, and to call for harsher treatment of suspects. So excessive policing actually provided enjoyment for Trump's followers. We're now having a trial about this guy, Kyle Rittenhouse, who did shoot. He may be acquitted as I'm speaking. So it's an interesting follow-up to this question. So this policing, excessive policing, provide enjoyment. Why? Because it's unnecessary violence that goes beyond what's necessary for the police officer to use and control the situation. So the excessive police violence gave Trump supporters a path to enjoyment that they would not have had without him, and without his embrace of the unruly, illegal policing. So this excess also controlled the barrier, and this is something really crucial to the right-wing form of enjoyment. It controlled the barrier between those who belonged and those who didn't. So that idea of controlling that barrier, policing the barrier between belonging and non-belonging, is, I think, what defines a right-wing enjoyment. It's dependent upon that barrier. So the violence created belonging for Trump devotees because it forced others into the position of non-belonging. So those drawing attention, say, to the nation's racism or poverty rates, revealed for the followers of Trump that they didn't properly belong to American society. So Trump organized the enjoyment of his supporters around the belonging of these supporters, which required highlighting that others didn't belong. So that's the really crucial point. So anyone taking note of the nation's failures helped to constitute the group of Trump supporters precisely by providing these outsiders whom the group could enjoy hating. So their enjoyment depended on someone occupying the position of non-belonging on the outside, someone who wouldn't fit within the social field and thus could serve as a site of enjoyment. So it's interesting that the enjoyment comes from those who are non-belonging outside, even though they're serving to make the group of those who belong. So the key is that those on the right didn't just disagree with their political opponents, but they actually experienced a feverish, enjoyable animus towards them. So this feverish animus was, I want to say, the political enjoyment of the right, an enjoyment that manifests itself in, you hear these terms all the time here, I don't know about around the world, owning the libs, bashing political correctness, and now the most recent form is attacking what they call CRT, or critical race theory. So the Make America Great Again movement needed enemies who were holding America back from this supposed return to greatness. Otherwise, the movement itself would lose its raison d'etre. So it wouldn't have any reason to be, and it would lose also its mode of enjoying. So it enjoyed through those it despised and through their position of non-belonging. And Trump promised the nation an enjoyment of an ethnically homogenous society that had clear enemies in the advocates of, say, political correctness or against police violence. So this term, political correctness, had a broad signification. It meant for him anything that spoke to impugn the history of the United States or the racist structure of American society. So you're being politically correct, in Trump's idiom, if you got in the way of any real unapologetic American enjoyment with qualms about the nation's actions or about those of its designated heroes. The irony, I think, for Trump's form of enjoyment, again, like all right-wing forms of enjoyment, is that it depends upon those who it vilifies in order to nourish it. So right-wing enjoyment is fundamentally parasitic. And we can see an example of this, I think, in the fight against those who wanted to remove statues commemorating Confederate war heroes. So the American Civil War and the devotion to the heroes of the South was an integral part of this form of enjoyment. So to take down Confederate statues, which was part of this movement in 2020 and even just prior to that, but to take them down was to impede American enjoyment by damaging the ability to enjoy the excess of America's slaveholding past. So no one among Trump's supporters cared about the statues, is interesting, until someone tried to take them down. So conservatives weren't flocking to pay homage to the statue of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis or any of these Confederate leaders prior to this attempt to knock them down. So the statues had no value. No one took pleasure in their aesthetic beauty, such that it was, but their excessiveness, their celebration of a past that no one could logically or morally defend, gave them an enjoyment value. So again, it's the way in which they stick out, the way they don't fit, gives them this enjoyment value, but it becomes clear only when they're attacked, that the enjoyment value becomes palpable when the detractors threaten the continued display of the statues or actually bring them down. And that occasioned a very famous rally that I'll talk about in a second. So the enjoyment value sent conservative activists marching into the streets to preserve them. And had the statues only provided pleasure, I want to contend, no one would have protested their removal. So the enjoyment that Trump promised and proffered required an enemy, such as those taking down the statues. And the enemy gives the conservative a position on which to find its own excessiveness. So it finds the excessiveness through the figure of the enemy. In response to Trump's ethnically homogenous nationalism, Joe Biden initially appeared to offer a different way of structuring enjoyment. So there's something new, something different. So for Biden, there was enjoyment simply in returning to normal, which meant, of course, simply returning to the capitalist American society before the Trump presidency. And his statement to European leaders, America's back, I think really typified this position. While just returning to normal seems to be a position relatively bereft of enjoyment, Biden's candidacy actually reconstituted normality, and in a way that brought tears of enjoyment to people when it triumphed. My girlfriend from high school emailed me, and she's like, she wasn't even a Democrat. She was a Republican, and she emailed me. She was like, I couldn't stop crying when Biden was elected. And that was the last I heard from her. I don't know what that means. So normality became a site of transcendent enjoyment after the Trump years, when corruption and prevarication functioned as the norm, right? So despite his overall pedestrian qualities as a candidate, or maybe even because of these qualities, Biden came to embody the perfect alternative to the form of enjoyment Trump offered. He presented people with their old political system as a new form of enjoyment, which led to Trump's defeat, or as Trump calls it, the big steal. So his conjuration of restored normality as a way of organizing enjoyment managed for a time to win more adherents than Trump's fervent nationalism. But Biden, I think, wasn't really so different from Trump as this account might suggest. Well, of course, he doesn't have Trump's racist nationalism and overt corruption, for sure. He took a tack remarkably similar to Trump by focusing on an enemy. So one could promise the enjoyment of a return to normal only if one had a figure of abnormality to fight against, right? This figure, who was it? It was Trump himself, right? Trump became the outsider destroying the American system that Biden and his followers could enjoy hating. So to support Biden was to enjoy through the excesses of Trump. And this is one reason why Biden's support cratered. I don't know if you know this, but it's utterly cratered now. It's lower than Trump's even was. It cratered soon after Trump's defeat. So the unifying figure, the enemy that served as a source of enjoyment, had disappeared. So although the contest between the enjoyment that Trump offered and what Biden counters with appears to have high stakes, the contest actually doesn't illustrate the divide between the forms of enjoyment that characterize right and left. So the existence of Biden as an alternative, I think, reveals, sadly, the bankruptcy of the contemporary left, not just in the United States, but I think we see this almost everywhere around the world. So while Trump might adequately represent a rightist form of enjoyment, I think he does, Biden does not provide a revelatory leftist counterexample. He just doesn't. The structure And maybe there's someone else in the American political scene that does, which I'll get to. The structure of enjoyment that he advocates bears too much of a resemblance, I think, to that of his opponent. His invocation of a return to normality falls short of a leftist mobilization that we might see in the work, see at work, in the Haiti of Toussaint Louverture, the Bolivia of Evo Morales, or even the movement surrounding Bernie Sanders here in the United States. So there are radical differences between the structure of right and left enjoyment that this opposition between Trump and Biden, or Zemmour and Macron in France doesn't, or AfD and whoever ends up being the winner in Germany doesn't capture. So in other words, we have to look beyond electoral battles if we want to see the different structures of enjoyment that conservative and emancipatory political movements offer. So by understanding the difference between right and left as the difference between competing forms of enjoyment, I think we can make sense of why right-wing movements seem to do such a better job of mobilizing people's emotions, and why left-wing movements always seem ready to collapse. So the advantages of the right, I think, are not just institutional. The fact that obviously the forces of conservatism own the means of production, but they're tied to the form of enjoyment that the right accesses. But I think despite these structural advantages, the right actually operates with an enjoyment that it cannot universalize, in direct contrast with that of the enjoyment of the left, which is inherently universalist. So right-wing enjoyment is necessarily provincial because it relies on an outsider that threatens it. So the threatening outsider is not a contingent development that the rightist encounters, but the sine qua non of right-wing enjoyment. The conservative position enjoys through this threat, which is why right-wing leaders constantly belabor the dangers posed by outsiders more than their own positive political programs. I was talking to a Vermont state representative in the hallway just prior to this talk, and he just said, I can't believe these Republicans, they never have a political program of their own, they just bash. And I'm like, that's, of course, that's the point. That's the form of enjoyment that they're offering. So their plans are empty of enjoyment, though, without this outsider that threatens to undo them. So they need the threat, otherwise they founder, right? So due to this formal requirement, rightist enjoyment structurally excludes the possibility of bringing everyone together under a conservative umbrella. For this position to deliver the enjoyment that drives it, someone has to play the heavy and not belong. I think this is really crucial for me. So every conservative project demands an enemy in order to make it appealing to its adherents. Unlike the right, the left need not keep anyone out of the enjoyment that it offers. Leftist enjoyment is intrinsically universalizable. So despite their different forms, both right and left enjoyment have the same origin. So every social order has contradictions that create points that appear impossible to inhabit from within the order itself. And enjoyment derives from these contradictions because they provide avenues for people to transcend the limits that the society lays down. So we're not just confined to the possibilities that the social order offers us and makes available to us. So to enjoy then is to do something like eclipse the given possibilities that the social order has available. And the contradictions of every social order, you could say, create openings to enjoy, openings to go beyond what's been authorized. Or another way to put it is enjoyment is an immanent transcendence, not an experience of the divine, not transcendent in that sense, but one in which we transcend the limits that the social order establishes as the constraints on the possible. So the social order is constructed in such a way that certain positions cannot register in its accounting. There's no possible social order that can account for everything. Certain positions simply don't exist as social possibilities, but these social impossibilities actually represent places where we can enjoy. For instance, let me just give a basic, really easy example, which is helpful to me, and I apologize for the simplicity of it. But the fundamental contradiction of a standard sexist society is to conceptualize the figure of the woman as both a non-sexual maternal figure and as a sex object. So sexism operates through this division of the woman into two contradictory identities. So if one is a non-sexual maternal figure, one cannot simultaneously be a sex object. So the two identities mutually exclude each other. And yet, sexist society constitutes female identity through these two identities, which puts all women all women in a contradictory position. That's the contrary situation. So sexist ideology attempts to deal with this contradiction. How? By dividing women into two camps. There's mothers on the one side, there's sex objects on the other. So in this way, the contradiction becomes an opposition between two different types of people. And I think this, my own little theory of ideology is that's what ideology does. It turns contradictions into opposition. So some are mothers, some are sex objects. So the contradiction becomes obscured in the particular differences between women, although the contradiction remains a problem that every woman has to address and confront. So the social order's fundamental contradiction creates a point of impossibility. What would it be in this case? The maternal sex object, right? The person that doesn't choose, that is both of these things. So to occupy this contradictory position is to exceed the confines and the limits, the positions available in sexist society. And it's such excess that opens up enjoyment. The emancipatory position, the stance of leftist enjoyment, I want to say, is to occupy the contradiction. That leftism discovers universality in the social contradiction where there is no recognition, no authorization. And this contradictory position is universal because it's available to everyone regardless of their social status or political power, that in a certain sense, everyone is in this position of the contradiction or of non-belonging. So this point of impossibility is socially impossible, but of course it's not ontologically impossible, which is why it is possible to run into sexualized mothers even in a very sexist society. The position that sexist society deems impossible is actually a real possibility, a position that one can take up in defiance of the prevailing social mandates, right? So within any social order, one can do the impossible and occupy the position that the social order deems impossible. But because occupying the impossible position brings the social contradiction to light, what happens? It entails ostracism and reprobation. So sexist society labels the sexualized mother what? Unfit, abomination, or even a slut, right? So, or people who have brought into the society collectively police it by looking at her askance, trying to discipline her into some kind of authorized identity. So such assaults, I think, indicate the threat that those who embrace the contradiction, occupy the impossible position, pose to the oppressive social structure. Those who take up the position of, say, the maternal sex object in sexist society occupy this society's contradiction and do the impossible. Embracing the contradiction in this way, I think, frees one from the dictates of social authority, and it frees one to do what? To enjoy. It frees one to enjoy. So enjoyment is possible in every social order because no social order is coherent and complete. Each is lacking. Each is beset by contradictions that emerge through the drive to constitute itself and become whole. If it were coherent, formed without any fissures, a social order would actually have no way to admit new members, which is obviously a requirement for every society, even that of the American group, the Shakers, who disdained sexual reproduction, but they still were invested in social reproduction. So in this sense, the limitations of the social order are necessary because they create the opening for new members. But they also provide the site for challenges to the order and for what I want to call leftist enjoyment. So a society constitutes itself as a whole by creating a barrier between itself and what's external to it. But this contrast between inside and outside is obviously essential for any social order, any society. And it manifests itself through the determination of belonging. So a society depends on recognizing those who belong and withholding recognition from those who don't in order to define itself. And this dividing line between belonging and non-belonging must exist to grant recognition and determine who belongs. But this is where I think the contradiction opens up the possibility for enjoyment. And the contradiction creates a space that doesn't fit within this regime of signification, or what I called before, a space of immanent transcendence. So there's a contradiction within every social order due to the status of the authority that polices belonging. So the social order that doles out recognition or belonging has its authority through the recognition of the members that the members of society give to it. So an authority is an authority insofar as most people in the society treat it as one. Even in democratic countries, it's not the vote that authorizes the leader. Instead, it's the collective belief in the validity of the vote or whatever process determines who the authority will be. Although the people don't consciously make a collective decision to endow someone with authority, their authorization is, I think, nonetheless a necessary condition for the erection of a figure of social authority. And I think this is the basic contradiction, right? So the social authority that distributes recognition must itself be recognized by those to whom it grants recognition. So there's a kind of infinite regress that emerges and prevents any social authority from actually having an authorized status. So the authority's authorization comes from those whom the authority itself recognizes as having the power to authorize the authority. Sorry for the convoluted nature of that sentence, but it, I think, captures the contradictory status of every authority. So as a result, there's no one with the authority to litigate between belonging and non-belonging to decide, in other words, who belongs, who doesn't belong. So this line between inside and outside has to be drawn, but there's no one authorized to draw it because that doesn't ultimately receive their authorization from an unauthorized source. So I think this is really the basic contradiction that haunts every social order, and it's the root of, say, that contradiction I described between the maternal and the sex object, right? You can trace the link, the through line from one to the other, I would want to claim. So the contradiction creates a porous social order, one populated by holes of non-belonging that always undermine its coherence, no matter how tightly bound up it is. So no one can be sure of belonging because there's no authorized authority that could ensure this belonging. And as a result, one's social identity is never secure, but always in question. So one's place within society is never certain, but always on the verge of being lost. And this means that I think everyone within the social order is virtually, not concretely, but virtually in the space of the sexualized mother within sexist society. That is, in the position of non-belonging, but people cling to the illusion of belonging in order to avoid confronting this actuality. Everyone relies on an unauthorized authority, but few admit this to themselves. They cling instead to, I think, this apparent security that resides in belonging. But again, all belonging is ultimately illusory. And it's the unauthorized status of social authority that leaves the members of society without any assurance of their belonging. So I strive to belong, but no recognition or validation can assure me that I've fully achieved it. So I'm stuck trying to belong, but never certain whether I do or not. And I think rather than being something to lament, it's precisely this failure to belong that opens up the possibility for enjoyment. So if one could belong to a social order and know that one received recognition from society, then this recognition would rule out enjoyment. So full recognition in the society would entail the complete evacuation of enjoyment. And enjoyment derives, you'd say it this other way, from the failure of enjoyment, from the point at which the social order ceases to authorize one's position, or what I've called the point of contradiction. So contradiction is, just to put another way, the essence of enjoyment, that it's the key to enjoyment. It's through the empty spaces in the social order that contradiction opens up that subjects are able to enjoy themselves. And since enjoyment is always the experience of excess, it occurs when one goes beyond the socially authorized space and takes up a position that doesn't fit within the map of the social order. So despite its clear appeal, I think we don't enjoy belonging and recognition, although of course we can take pleasure in them, right? So belonging and recognition confine us within a symbolic identity and strip away all potential for autonomy. So there's a link, I think, between enjoyment and freedom, which is pretty interesting. So there's no enjoyment in fitting in. We enjoy the failure of the social order, the inability to fit in, the points at which we can go beyond the options that society lays out for us and inhabit this unauthorized space of non-belonging. So you could say all enjoyment emerges out of non-belonging from occupying the position of not fitting. So I think the space for enjoyment exists because the structure of language that undergirds the social order centers around what can't be represented. So language doesn't aim at naming what we can perceive, but what we can't. There's a hole within every language that marks this fundamental absence. So the paradox of language holds, I think, the key to making sense how the space of enjoyment emerges within the structure of signification. And Richard Boothby, I think, has a nice statement about this. He says, the innermost essence of language functions to evoke something that is missing in the object. In its most primordial function, language serves to name the no thing. What most profoundly sets speech in motion is a dimension of absence in perception, a lack that haunts perceptual presence, a dimension of perception that remains uncognizable. So the impossible that can't be represented is a structural necessity for language and thus for the social order. So it's precisely this point of impossibility that highlights what gives our existence its worth. So this point creates the opening for enjoyment, which occurs where the structure is at odds with what it can account for and with what goes on. So enjoyment emerges, you could say, when what cannot happen does happen. And I think I like this statement because the contradiction of it, I think, shows how enjoyment is linked to contradiction and relies on it, depends on it. So the social order formally rules something out, deems it contradictory, and that's where enjoyment emerges. So the field of possibilities in any society always involves a contradiction, and enjoyment is the experience of this impossible position. And I think the genuine political act has to occupy this position of the impossible. Although many political struggles seem to involve conflicting possibilities, like more or less taxes, universal private health care, increased military spending, or money for the homeless, the real political struggle focuses on what the social order characterizes as impossible. And to do the impossible is to break from the field of given possibilities within a society and to change the social coordinates. And when a political act accomplishes this, it achieves a transcendence relative to the field of possibilities that generates enjoyment. But that's the site of enjoyment. And I think Frantz Fanon, in his theorization of decolonial struggle, nicely talks about several occasions when he sees the impossible happening, when colonized subjects refuse a subservient position that the colonizer wants to put them in. And this is, for Fanon, the essence of the fight against colonialism. By refusing the possibilities that colonialism presents, the colonized subject does what appears to be impossible according to the structure of colonial relations. And this is what he says in Wretched of the Earth. He says the colonized subject discovers that his or her life, his or her breathing, heartbeats are the same as the colonists. They discover that the skin of the colonists is not worth more than the natives. In other words, the world receives a fundamental jolt. So occupying the position of the impossible, that of equality for the colonized subject, brings with it the enjoyment of the impossible. The enjoyment comes as a jolt, as Fanon says, for the oppressing colonizer, but also a jolt for the colonized subjects themselves. So to do the impossible in this sense is to occupy the fundamental point of contradiction within the social order. So colonial society deems the colonized unequal to the colonizer, but at the same time, the colonizers trumpet a creed of human equality. So when the colonized actually assert their equality, they make this contradiction evident, as Fanon nicely points out, and he shows that the enjoyment of occupying the contradictory point within colonial society is actually a leftist enjoyment that portends the end of that society. So occupying this position is an enjoyable accomplishment of the impossible. So this doing the impossible always creates a psychic disturbance. It's the effect of a radical, the enjoyment of the impossible, you could say, is the enjoyment of a radical disruption. And because of the emergence of this through disruption, because of its emergence through this disruption of the established social order, enjoyment, I think, seems to tilt inherently to the left. That enjoyment marks a threat to the ruling order because it doesn't fit properly within that order. But of course, the problem is that disruption isn't always emancipatory. The right is also able to marshal enjoyment for conservative or even reactionary purposes as easily as, maybe more easily than, the left does so for the sake of emancipation. So the right can take the disruptiveness of enjoyment and use it to further a sense of belonging for some, as long as there are others who don't belong. But the leftist or emancipatory project is the embrace of a radical enjoyment of contradiction and the enjoyment of non-belonging. I think that's how I define it. That's what's crucial to me. So this is visible, I think, in leftist movements throughout human history, from the Spartacus revolt in ancient Rome, to the Haitian Revolution, to the Russian Revolution, to the Dalit Buddhist movement in India, to the Zapatista movement in Mexico, to Black Lives Matter in the contemporary United States. So the emancipatory project focuses on privileging the fact of non-belonging and taking this non-belonging as the model for the enjoyment that it proffers. So those who don't belong to the society and receive no recognition become the focus of leftist enjoyment. And it's from the perspective of emancipation, these figures of non-belonging are not the exceptions to the rule, but the paradigm for all subjectivity. So the subject is actually defined by its failure to belong, its inability to fit in within the assigned place that the social order lays out. So the failure is actually what opens up the possibility of enjoyment. But those who attempt to belong to the social order, or believe they belong, they flee their subjectivity into the promised coherent stability of a symbolic identity, which is precisely what's denied to the figures of non-belonging, such as the colonized in Algeria, where Fanon, of course, was fighting for independence. So whether it's slaves in Haiti or Dalits in India, emancipation recognizes that non-belonging actually harbors all of the social order's enjoyment. And it's not an exceptional position that we should strive to eliminate, but the basic form of enjoying subjectivity that becomes obfuscated in those who strive to belong. So even though the people who are reduced to non-belonging have no social advantages and suffer tremendous oppression, they make evident the limits of the social order that emerge through its contradictions. So enjoyment emanates from the position of non-belonging that the social order does not recognize. It's not just that particular figures of non-belonging that have a monopoly on this enjoyment. The enjoyment of non-belonging is actually available to everyone because no one can assuredly belong. And recognizing this universality of non-belonging is, I want to claim, the emancipatory project. So by privileging the enjoyment of non-belonging, emancipation tries to make clear the universality of non-belonging, which is, again, I think, the key to universal emancipation. Rather than continuing to emphasize the distinction between those who belong and those who don't, the emancipatory project emphasizes that there is no belonging, that all belonging is an illusion sustained only through this contrast with non-belonging. I think this is what Fanon is actually getting at when he describes the moment of emancipation when the colonized subject ceases to believe in the colonizer's difference. At this point, the figure of non-belonging sees that belonging is illusory. And this is the move that the colonizer has to make as well. To give up the sense of belonging is the only path to emancipation. And the leftist movement works through an identification with figures of non-belonging that attempt to make evident the universality of non-belonging and thus realize the emancipatory project. So the more one invests oneself in belonging, the more one experiences the inadequacy of recognition and the failure of belonging. And this is why those who strive to belong constantly need to refer and emphasize the non-belonging of others. The left, in contrast, I think, enjoys the social order's internal failure. So no matter what the structure of the social order is. So for the left, the aim is to occupy the position of impossibility where the social contradiction occurs. And it's inherently universal. Why? Because it doesn't rely on an enemy. I think there's no leftism with an enemy. But the right, I think it rejects the impossible contradiction and attempts to assert social belonging through the figure of the enemy. That is absolutely necessary. So I think the contrast between right and left enjoyment is nicely evident in the slogans chanted at rallies during the Trump presidency. So at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was occasioned by possibly bringing down a Robert E. Lee statue, a Confederate leader statue. On August 11th, 2017, protesters chanted a couple of things. Jews will not replace us, and they also chanted blood and soil. So obviously a revival of Blut and Boden, the Nazi watchwords. So this refrain, I think, typifies the rightist form of enjoyment because what does it do? It identifies an enemy that gives the protesters a sense of their own belonging, since it marks a threat to that belonging, the threat of replacement. The enemy makes their position of belonging an enjoyable one. So they're parasitically enjoying through that figure of the non-belonging enemy. They enjoy through those whom they fear will replace them. And without the enemy to chant about, they wouldn't have come to the rally. That's absolutely clear. I think it's interesting to contrast this with the protest in 2020, the massive protests against the police murder of George Floyd, which is a nice, I think, leftist contrast, even though all the protesters were not obviously leftist. So what's interesting is demonstrators here didn't say, the police will not replace us. What did they say? They said, I can't breathe, which were the words of the dying George Floyd, right? So the difference between the slogan of Charlottesville and that of Minneapolis, which is where Floyd's murder took place, encapsulates, I think, the difference between rightist and leftist politics. That the protesters identified themselves with the figure of non-belonging, who the police killed precisely because they viewed him through the lens of his non-belonging, which thus the "I can't breathe" statement. For the police, George Floyd did not belong, which is why an officer could crush his throat without any compunction. The leftist movement that arose in the wake of Floyd's death focused on this non-belonging and attempted to reveal its universality, thus the chant, to force, in so doing, those who felt secure in their belonging to see themselves in George Floyd and not in the police choking the life out of him. That was the key way that they were trying to change how people saw the event. So the rallies that took place in the wake of Floyd's murder demonstrated, I think, a leftist enjoyment. People were protesting an unjust structure by aligning themselves with the person crushed by it. The enjoyment didn't require an enemy to attack, but occurred through the assertion of universal non-belonging. And I think it's absolutely crucial that an emancipatory movement does not militate for universal belonging. That is, there can be no emancipatory attempt to bring all those who don't belong within the social order, because the sense of belonging can't be universalized. No matter how many people we include, belonging will always require some who don't belong and have to be outside in order to affirm the belonging of those who do. So if a movement argues for more belonging, we know it's inherently impossible to universalize, and thus at least implicitly a conservative movement. That there's, to put it this way, there's no emancipation of the particular. So the rightist attempt to forge belonging for a particular group, I think, always founders on the problem of contradiction that undermines belonging. So no matter how much belonging the right-wing movement creates, it's never enough. So there's always an attempt to get more and more and more, whereas the left has a problem because it can never rely on belonging at all. And this is, I think, why leftism has nothing to hold people together other than their commitment to a shared failure to belong and the enjoyment that this failure provides. And so in a way, the tenuousness of the leftist bond is at once the source of its enjoyment. I want to conclude with trying to make evident the contrast between rightist and leftist enjoyment in the arena of comedy, although perhaps not in the way that one might initially think. It's not the case, unfortunately, I wish this were true, that leftists were always funny and rightists just lack a sense of humor, or even the converse, that rightists are funny and the politically correct leftists can never make a joke. I don't think things are quite so clear cut. I think we can actually look at jokes and determine which are right and left. And I think if we look at the right ones, we can see how the form of enjoyment gets made evident by the joke. So I think there's, in this sense, there's a basic political division or distinction operating in comedy. So what happens? So right-wing jokes operate according to a strict opposition between belonging and non-belonging, just like right-wing enjoyment does. So this type of joke identifies a contradiction within the enemy who doesn't belong and finds the humor in it, but it leaves the friend, I'm using Carl Schmitt's distinction, it leaves the friend or the person telling the joke free from any evident contradiction. So a joke isn't conservative, I don't think, contrary to popular opinion, just because it punches down. Instead, the conservative dimension of the right-wing joke derives not from who it targets, but from whom it insulates from contradiction. That's where conservatism lies. So right-wing comedy has those who belong that it refuses to make fun of. A genuine leftist comedy, I think, accepts no such restrictions, but sees the comedy of contradiction everywhere, universally. So the right-wing structure of a joke becomes apparent if we look at any anti-communist joke. I have a couple here. So the first one goes like this. What's the best way to kill communists? The answer, communism. Okay, so here's another one. What do communists have before candles? The answer, electricity. So okay, they're not bad, they're kind of funny. So what these jokes correctly, I think, apprehend the self-destructive manifestation of, obviously, of actual communist experiments in the 20th century. But they're right-wing jokes because they postulate the communist as an enemy that succumbs to contradiction, whereas the communist is left, or sorry, another fun, great slip, the anti-communist is left intact, right? So although the joke apprehends how communism undermines itself, or at least has done so historically, it leaves the anti-communist undivided, positions communism in the position of the enemy to be annihilated, destroyed. or to be relegated to barbarism. So we know this is a right-wing joke because it preserves the anti-communist position as a position free from any contradiction. So rightist enjoyment confines itself to those who belong, to those who aren't communists. Think about this joke, or these jokes. While communists in the jokes suffer from contradiction, the anti-communist telling the joke doesn't. Instead, they enjoy through the contradiction that undermines communism while insulating the teller from this contradiction. This form of enjoyment, I think, is necessarily particular and cannot accede to the universal, right? Because it can't include the communists that it's making fun of. If it were to become universal, it would lose the exclusivity that gives it its right-wing hue. And through this insistence on belonging, rightist enjoyment depends on the enemy that its jokes turn into a source of mockery. And a mockery correctly identifies lack in the enemy. Problem is that it leaves the subject itself unstained by contradiction, which is why it's not mocking enough. So leftism, in contrast, finds enjoyment within its own contradiction. And this enjoyment is universal because it's inherent in every identity. So the fundamental contradiction that animates leftist politics is the insistence on universal non-belonging that leaves the position of belonging empty, as I've tried to make the case. So structurally, there's a position of belonging, no one can occupy it. So this dynamic is, I think, inherently humorous and lends itself to jokes. And I'm going to look at one. This is one of my all-time favorite jokes, so I hope you think it's funny. And if you don't, if you've heard it before, sorry. And if you don't think it's funny, that makes me very sad. So here's what happens. So a visitor arrives at a monastery to investigate what life is like at the monastery, right? So one of the monks feels bad for him, agrees to act as his guide and to explain the idiosyncratic ways of the monastery to the visitor. So dinner time comes. The monk takes the visitor to this large dining hall. They start to eat. And then all of a sudden, a random monk yells out, 15. And the whole hall erupts with laughter. And the visitor, he's like totally perplexed. He's like, what is happening? What's this bizarre ritual? And he asks the guide for some kind of explanation. The guide says, here's the thing. We've all been together for so long that we know all the jokes that everyone tells. So rather than going through the trouble of explaining a whole joke, we just use the shortcut of a number. And the guy, the visitor's like, okay, I get it. And so just after this explanation, another monk yells out, 56. But this time the laughter is a little more subdued. And this perplexes the visitor again. He's like, what happened? And the guy goes, look, it's simple. That joke just wasn't as funny as the first one. And by this time, though, the visitor thinks, hey, I've kind of got the hang of it. And he wants to try his hand at telling a joke. So he shouts out, 125. And then the dining hall just explodes in even more laughter than that occasioned the first joke. And the visitor says to the guide, wow, I must have told a really funny one. And the guy responds, well, actually, we hadn't heard that one before. And so what's fascinating about this joke, I think, is that it recounts laughter at an empty space. So everyone laughs at a joke that no one knows, right? So the joke allows the listener to join in the laughter at a joke that doesn't exist. So the monastery joke, I think, provides the perfect paradigm for leftist enjoyment because there is no one who knows the joke that provokes the laughter in everyone, right? The group that belongs, those who know the joke, is empty. Everyone laughs, but no one knows the joke that they are collectively laughing at. No one belongs, although there is a universal non-belonging. Even the monks who've lived their whole lives at the monastery inhabit the same position of non-belonging because the joke, they don't know it any more than the visitor does. The non-belonging is not, however, a new form of belonging precisely because there's no one excluded from it. It's a non-belonging that doesn't require anything or anyone to oppose itself to, but rather uses belonging as a formal position with which to distinguish its universality. So the enjoyment in the monastery joke doesn't depend on anyone in the position of the enemy. The adversary is a form, not a content, an absence rather than an identifiable enemy. So the left enjoys what is not there, just like the joke that the visitor to the monastery tells. The non-existence of the joke, I think, corresponds to the number that he yells out. And this, we laugh together, I think, hopefully, at the impossible position that the joke itself occupies and the contradiction that this implies. In leftist comedy, there's no position immune to the reach of contradiction because what leftism is the enjoyment of contradiction. That all, in some sense, no one need be barred from it for someone to experience. Some don't have to suffer so that others can enjoy. All suffer so that no one is excluded from enjoyment. And I think the contrast between the monastery joke and the anti-communist joke is nicely shows, to me, the contrast between left and right enjoyment. And as the contrast suggests, right and left aren't so much opposed ways of looking at the world, but opposed structures of enjoyment. And if right-wing political activity has an inherent advantage over leftism, it consists in what? The facility with which the right can structure a path to enjoyment. It's always easy to identify an enemy, I think. Well, it's much more difficult to recognize absence as the source of enjoyment. But left-wing enjoyment must sustain the embrace of contradiction that produces universal non-belonging. The alternative is always easier because it transforms contradiction into opposition, gives us someone to fight against, someone to hate. But by giving us someone to hate, right-wing enjoyment enables us to avoid confronting our own contradictory position. But contradiction, I think, nonetheless appeals to us because it is the source of all enjoyment, even the conservative form of enjoyment that translates it into opposition in order to make it more digestible. So my idea is laugh at the monastery joke, don't laugh at the anti-communism joke. That's it.
It was a pleasure having you, at least virtually.
Yeah, Frank, thank you so much for having me, and it was so enjoyable for me.
I hope we can get you to Scotland at one point.
I would like to go sometime.